Please go. There's microphone standing in the aisles, and if you would please use them. And could Jonathan and Terry come back up here and maybe just sit here with live mics, and questions would be directed to them.
Yes. I'd love to ask both Professor Cole and Professor Fisher if they see any possibility. I may have to wait and buy Professor Cole's book to get the answer, but maybe he can give us a sneak preview of inter-institutional agreements between universities that would prevent a race to the bottom of faculty fleeing to the institution with the lowest conflict of interest standards.
Well, I think it would be extremely, and will be extremely difficult. I can recount to you the resistance that I had when I was provost and was dealing with the Princeton provost, when I thought we would de facto merge our history departments, both of which were probably certainly in the top 10, maybe in the top 5. And the leaders of the institution were quite interested in it, but the faculties, when it was brought to them, not a single faculty member wanted to consider the merging of these things, and in part because they thought that it violated faculty prerogatives, and it was conflicted with their interests to make choices which they thought would be limited. So I think that it will be increasingly difficult for institutions to formulate acceptable conflict of interest policies when they become leagues rather than individuals, if that speaks to your question.
Okay. Can we go to that side, please? Louder, please.
The mic is not on. Getting some exercise today? Testing.
Okay. Jim Snyder, lab fellow here at Cypher Center. A question for Terry Fisher. 3 very brief questions. Are the fellows covered, the 52 fellows at the Berkman Center? You're talking about faculty. Are they covered by these ethical conflicts of interest? Second, what about revolving door relationships? I see the U.S. Department of State, for example, as one of your funders. I know that the U.S. Department gave roughly $2 million to a Washington, D.C. think tank, and then the person who gave that those funds left and became a fellow at that think tank 3 months after leaving the State Department. These revolving door relationships are very important in Washington, D.C. We don't normally think of them in an academic setting, but sometimes they do apply. And the third one, and most important, is the question of deliverables. You said you wouldn't accept money where there are deliverables. So I know you listed all those funders, and I know all those funders are very strict generally in requiring deliverables. And then the question is really, how do you define a deliverable? So when you don't take corporate money because the perception is there are strings attached and people know the agenda. So just the last, when you get money from somebody like the Ford Foundation, they are known to everybody to have a clear agenda like a corporation. I mean, insiders, maybe not the public. And the question is, that can be viewed as a deliverable, just like a corporation. How do you define deliverable in these relationships? I don't see that much of a difference between taking money from a foundation and having a known agenda in a corporation. So that's the question. I mean, there could be, good agendas and bad agendas. Yeah, yeah.
As to the first, yes, we impose the same guidelines on the fellows that the faculty members have. As to the second, we have not had to confront a revolving door issue vis-a-vis the Department of Defense, who I think was your example, but have had to address one with respect to a corporation, Microsoft in particular. And we dealt with it, it's related to Derek's question earlier, in an ad hoc fashion through a combination of delay and cabining the work that the person in question did to address the risk. As to the third, It's true that sometimes public funders, in contrast to corporations, have tacitly strong interest or expectations in outcomes. And one might, recognizing this, extend the prohibition from accepting sponsored research from corporations to accepting money at all from such either foundations or conceivably even government agencies. And we don't, but strive internally to be especially vigilant for independence. So I'll give you an example. The example was we were hired by, I'm deliberately using the term in its potentially most dangerous sense, we were commissioned by the 49 state attorneys general a couple of years ago to study the risks of injury to teenagers through online behavior. And we did a lot of research and concluded that the research did not sustain an increased risk of sexual predation or other hazards from the stereotypical image of the person using online vehicles to recruit and then contact and then abuse young people. But we did find a dramatically increased risk of peer bullying with potentially catastrophic outcomes, and reported as much to the attorneys general. This was extremely unpopular because their interest, which we became increasingly aware of as we proceeded, was to highlight the hazards of predators lurking in the bushes and using the internet to recruit victims. And they were very unhappy with our recommendations, and we were formally denounced by some of the attorneys general. I'm proud to say that actually we turned out to be right on this score, but it's an illustration of the risk, but also the efforts we go to try to preserve in the situations, the sort you describe, autonomy.
Thank you. Larry.
Terry, so I was interested in the way in which you framed the ultimate test of the appropriate conflict, which is what someone appropriately informed should understand. And I wonder, with an institution like the Berkman Center, which is, of course, not living merely within the academic circles, it has a very prominent public face, whether there is a more offensive strategy that could be taken to deal with the problem of misunderstanding. Because you can structure a relationship, for example, your corporate funding relationship, that I think anybody who understands the way things work would believe is perfectly appropriate to avoid the wrong kind of influences. Yet, as you've experienced, that very same policy, when translated into the public media, or in particular the internet media, which is very close to what Berkman Center does, that appropriateness is completely lost. People don't understand the way the institution functions enough to believe that the right kind of integrity or independence is being maintained. And I wonder whether that points to the need for us to more affirmatively begin to articulate, independent of Berkman perhaps, but standards that institutions like Berkman could point to say, see, we're doing it in a gold standard-like way. You might wonder that the institution, Google, is giving money to Harvard University, and so therefore the Harvard provost might be calling Terry Fisher and telling Terry Fisher not to insult Google. You might, in your cynical, conspiratorial way, worry about that, but we've lived up to the standards that have been articulated as the gold standard for this kind of funding. I wonder whether you feel like there's not enough of that out there for you to be able to rely upon, and therefore you're forced into an overly defensive posture as these, what I think of are not fair questions, get pushed back on you because of the prominence of Berkman in public.
All right, that's a typically difficult question, which I hadn't thought about in quite those terms before. But Certainly descriptively, you're right that I experience this as an area in which we're confronted with problems for which there are, of course, analogs, but no precise precedents, and we respond. We try to anticipate particular controversies, but we are defensive in the sense you just described. So it surely would be advantageous for us to be able to refer to a gold standard, for example, a set of guidelines developed by a group like today. I would hope that those standards, if we collectively were able to generate them, and it's something other than ad hoc, which is vulnerable to precisely the criticism I think was implicit in Derek's question, would not privilege renunciation of an engagement. That is a temptation in this area. It may be the one zone in which the two of us may disagree, in which I feel the appeal of the less entangled state of the university, perhaps the great research university some 30 years ago. And I sense what I take to be one of your messages about the hazards that we are increasingly running by drifting away from that ideal. But indulging for the moment the dangerous hypothesis the Berkman Center is in this respect representative, think it would be too bad to back away from engagement and instead accepting the complexities associated with engagement, financial and institutional engagement. We then collectively took up the hard task of articulating guidelines collectively, which would then help all of us.
If I just might add, I'm not sure that we do disagree that much, Terry. It's possible that we do. Because at the end of your talk, I thought you emphasized this idea about culture and the internalization of culture. And I guess what I was saying was that some of the culture that had existed 30, 40, 50 years ago, when these universities were a lot smaller, when they didn't have the magnitude of the research enterprise that they did, had been largely internalized by largely, not totally, internalized by the culture of the professoriate and the university itself, and that was breaking down, and that we really had to reestablish that culture or a new culture that would be part of the makeup and thinking of the individual faculty members as they approach these problems. And that's one of the things that I think I would be looking for in any kind of development of policy or rules, to the extent that you can do that in a generalized way.
Okay, can we go to the question on the right, please?
Thanks for a couple of great presentations. Steve Jaffe from Dana-Farber in the medical school. I'll direct my question to either of you that wants to take it. It was actually prompted by something that Professor Korn said during his opening remarks. Up until this morning, I had always had the vision that this problem of conflict of interest was created by the gravitational pull, whether for faculty or for institutions, of money from corporations and other potential sources. And then your remarks about allegiance to the institutions and the missions of the institutions, of the faculty, and also I would suggest of the institutional leaders, led me to a hypothesis that I'd like to get you to react to, which is that at the same time, perhaps, there's a weakening of the gravitational pull from the institutions of the mission and allegiance to the institution, so that faculty members, perhaps in addition to being more attracted by the availability of money and other things that come from the outside, may be less committed to the missions of the institutions, to the institutions themselves, and perhaps also of the leadership. So it's just a hypothesis, and I'd love to get reactions from either of you and perhaps from Professor Korn as well.
Well, and David can react to this. My own fear is that these norms and values that we were talking about are no longer even seen as norms or values. That is to say, in some of the cases that have come up, the egregious cases, and I don't think there are as many as one thinks, actually, but there are cases that certainly hit the press and are real violations of ethics and morals, and are clearly conflicts. But the interesting thing is that very often chairmen of departments and individuals within these institutions see nothing wrong about what has been done. And that, it seems to me, is a change in culture. I mean, you might decide to take it, and you might decide that the rules ought to be changed, but to think that there's absolutely nothing wrong, or there isn't a conflict of interest involved, it does represent a stark change in medical schools and elsewhere.
I'll add only one thing to that. The BayhDole Act and the adjustment of university technology transfer offices to a monetizing strategy has contributed to this unraveling. It was a mistake, and we should repeal it.
Well, that opens not only a volume, but a large set of volumes of issues. Could I suggest that we hold that one until later in the day when there have been more presentations and things? Of course, it's a very, very important question, and we could spend the rest of the day just answering that. Okay? Jen?
So this is a question for both speakers, and also David, if you want to chime in. What's really attractive about Terry's proposition of banning funding that is not consonant with mission, I was trying to think of how that would generalize and how you might manage that at the university level. So one might imagine that the mission of the business school would allow it to take money for certain projects related to, say, marketing, but at the same time, the School of Public Health may be examining these marketing practices and coming out with results that are adverse to the firm that's funding the research at the business school. They may appeal to a higher level at the university level, which has its own mission, and I'm wondering how you might think about, or how we might think about managing that at the university level.
That's a great question. So if a common culture of respect for these values exists at the university, then I think it's perfectly appropriate, as you suggest, for the systems of rules adopted and implemented in the separate schools to vary. We can see that certainly at Harvard now, where the law school strains a bit at the guidelines imposed by the university as a whole, because the combination of benefits and temptations associated with different kinds of outside engagement is different from that appears in other contexts. And the university should be organized so as to accept those variations among schools. But that only works if the schools themselves, or the administration of the schools themselves, share the common mission. If instead they have independent monetizing ambitions, then you get a collective action problem, just like you do as between individual faculty members in the university.
I should note that there is part of this whole conflict of interest problem that has been avoided and essentially grandfathered, and that has to do with royalties from publications of books of various kinds, and textbooks, for example, where, believe me or not, there can be conflicts that arise. For example, I know a prominent American historian who was writing about 20th century American history, and I did a content analysis, and there were more references to Madonna the singer than there was to any science. And when I asked, why this was so, he said, well, the publishers had me take all of that out because science doesn't sell. And whether or not that represents a conflict of his judgment and his values, I don't know, but he took it out, and he made a lot of money off of that textbook, none of which was subject to conflict of interest scrutiny within the university, and none of it, as far as I know, is involved in conflict of interest policy. at the university because it's such an old way in which faculty members have published. And as Hunter Rawlings pointed out, most books only sell 300 copies anyway, so they don't get any royalties. So it's perhaps a non-issue. But for some, it is, especially in law schools. Textbooks, I suspect, earn a lot of money for some of its authors. And what goes in, what goes out, and how publishers determine whether or not you talk about certain subjects or not could potentially represent conflicts that we don't even think about.
Could I just make one very quick comment, and that is, in response to Professor Fisher's comment, the Harvard University individual financial conflict of interest policy, which was put together essentially by a very hardworking trans-university, all 10 schools represented on a committee, was built very specifically in an effort to lay out some binding guidelines and principles for the entire university. And by the way, it's a public document. Any of you that want to see it can get it. Binding principles and guidelines for the entire university and a couple of minimum requirements like must annually file disclosures of such as that. But then left it to each school to implement, to flesh out the skeleton, so to speak, and implement it in a way that was most compatible to the culture of that school and its various disciplines and professional activities, because they are exceedingly different across a university with many different schools. I mean, what goes in the medical school does not go in an H&S, FAS, and what goes in the design school would not go in the medical school. It's just very, very, very different. And I thought that the committee was very wise to adopt that approach of an overall frame with individual differences permissible in the details of how they implement it. So it may not have succeeded, and it certainly wasn't touted as being perfect, but that's what the effort was. Anyway, Abby?
Yes, thank you. I'm Abby Brown, a Lab Fellow. I wanted to probe something that came up in Terry's talk, although I think any of you guys may have something interesting to share, which is this notion of reputation being an effective barrier. I accept the assumption that professors are concerned with their reputation and their gravitas, but when you look at fairly high-profile scandals of people having obvious conflicts of interest, and I think of the movie Inside Job or some of the medical scandals that have come out, most of those faculty members still have their reputations relatively well intact. Now, I'm sure that they felt some discomfort, but they're still on TV, they're still teaching classes, they're still treated as peers. So the reputational effects may or may not be as catastrophic as we're assuming when we assume that faculty won't risk their reputation for some kind of conflict. Now, obviously, there are counterexamples to that, but I think the kind of median conflicted researcher, their reputational costs are manageable, particularly if they're being paid extraordinarily well. And also, when one weighs that against the reputational costs of going swimming upstream, as we'll see, I think, with the Oliveri case later today. So if you could comment on that.
Well, let me just comment tangentially, and then others may want to be more direct, have more direct responses. One of the things that I fear about today's meeting is that we won't talk about the need for empirical research on these issues. I mean, a lot of what we talk about is anecdotal. And we really don't know rates. We don't know what the levels of conflict is or abridgment of these norms. We talk about them as if they're widespread or they're becoming more widespread, yet we have almost no information of an empirical nature about whether or not it's trending up, it's steady, what are the nature of the conflicts. And as far as I can tell, no one is really doing any work in this area. And it is an area of some importance. And it's not easy to find out until the conflicts are disclosed, as someone mentioned earlier. But it would be extremely helpful to know whether or not we're dealing with a very, very serious and widespread problem in certain areas, or whether or not these are cases of fraud in science which are occasionally come to light and which are not widespread necessarily and are self-corrected by the institutions themselves. So I hope at some point there is a call here for greater empirical work on this subject.
Francis, we only have about 4 minutes left for this.
Yeah, I'll just be
Q&A.
very brief. I mean, this is addressed to Professor Cole. I mean, you talked about the importance of culture and ethics, the role of humanities in all this discussion, so I'm just going to say something in that regard. You mentioned, you said that the growth of knowledge may outweigh the costs of less regulation. And I just want to point out that the whole idea of the cost-benefit analysis in this area is itself a change in the culture, because many of the regulations were introduced as what we would call side constraints. You take the Milgram experiments. We learned a very important piece of information from the Milgram experiments, in which I assume people know what those experiments were. But the idea of imposing that sort of a cost on the subjects of the experiment, psychological trauma, whatever, was thought to be a constraint against even the introduction of, very important knowledge into the community. So I just want to say that with respect to the importance of regulation or the unimportance of it, that a cost-benefit analysis is not the approach I would recommend for this. That's all I wanted to remind people of, that we may sacrifice a great deal of knowledge because we have constraints, and yet those constraints may be ethically required.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but the question arises as to whether or not we put entire fields out of business, for example. I mean, and maybe the answer is in terms of your own values or the institution's values, that's appropriate. But there's small-scale psychological research which is based upon experimentation, which is based upon deception, which has been essentially put out of business. Now, when you have experiments in which people like Stanley Schachter is trying to study obesity, probably incorrectly, but nonetheless, he was trying to study obesity by having college students looking at clocks, one of which was moving twice as fast as the other, to try to find out whether people were eating by time or eating by hunger. I'm not sure how damaging that was to the individuals, but you probably couldn't pass an institutional review board these days. And, I'm not sure the knowledge was that great that it came of it. And I'm not necessarily saying that cost-benefit analysis is the correct approach, but there has to be some way of weighing what's lost and what is gained by restrictions on research of various kinds.
Okay. Last question, please.
I'm doing, Mildred Schwartz, I'm a non-resident fellow. I'm doing research on a very large health-related university, and the practice of extra compensation for physicians and some other professionals through their work in the teaching hospital appeared to lead to certain conflicts and even to institutional corruption through ingenious methods of getting extra compensation from both private and government insurance. And I'd be interested in your comments if this is something that has come up in other places and what your reaction is to it.
David, you know more about
We yield to the doctor here.
Yeah, I'd have to, with all respect, I'd have to understand, I'd have to have a conversation with you afterwards maybe, and I just don't understand the problem that you're addressing, and maybe it's just because we need to talk together, which I'm happy to do, but I can't answer
There's no
it
time
now.
now for me to elaborate, in other words, but...
Well, we can't, because we're going into the break, so you and I can elaborate together at the break if you like. Sorry about the disruption in the schedule this morning. I think we used the time very, very richly in the questions and answers. We have now 15 minutes till 11:05 for the break, and then we come back and start promptly at 11:05.
Terry, I very much enjoyed your